I'm Reverend Cooper from Community Presbyterian Church, and I am bringing you our final installment on the Bible study for the book of Proverbs. Last week we looked at chapters 10 through 22:16, and that introduced the wisdom sayings portion of the book of Proverbs, and we continue that portion today as we pick up at 22:17 and take that through 31:9. Those are continued wisdom sayings, and then the final bookend is nowhere near the length of the first bookend, which is 9 chapters, chapters 1 through 9. It is simply chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, a new narratival portion, which is actually a poem. But first, let's talk about the second chunk of chapters that provides more wisdom sayings. The first sort of chunk of that is given to us in chapters 22:17 through 24:22. And those are borrowed from Egyptian wisdom codes of conduct. And it's noted that it's taken pretty directly from the instruction of Amenemope. I've been trying to make sure I said that correctly. And you can tell that there's some outside influence there simply by virtue of the fact that it is more focused on courtly wisdom than it is on just standard behaviors that would happen within society. This is taken in sort of its own realm, if you will. And so it's kind of plopped into the book of Proverbs. Kingly, courtly wisdom, which is borrowed from Egypt. And that just sort of goes towards the way in which the ancient Near East often influenced the wisdom sayings and the work in the ancient Near East. Those types of things would influence one another, and the Bible was not written independently of those influences. It was clearly influenced by it. Then picking up at 24:23 through chapter 29, those are purportedly sayings of Solomon, that is the wisest king in all the land of Israel. Those wisdom sayings are attributed to him. Again, you can see that there's a more kingly and courtly tone to the instruction in all of those verses. And then in chapter 30, we have the sayings of Agur. And in 31:1 through 9, we have a lesson from King Lemuel's mother to King Lemuel. And so in terms of how the ancient Near East literature influenced one another and all of that, you can see that there's a lot of different sources being edited together here. And it's understood that that's taking place. This isn't just purely wisdom straight out of Jerusalem's temple from King Solomon. There's different sources. It is edited together, and that raises issues for some biblical interpreters. But I will just say that that is largely supported by modern and contemporary scholars. Agur and Lemuel are unknown, so that just further reiterates the way in which this was wisdom collected from the ancient Near East at large. You can't pinpoint who these people are, but they are ancient Near Eastern names. And so where exactly they come from is a great question. And so we get to the most interesting part of this entire book, if you ask me. I like to call it the crowning glory. It is the Proverbs 31 woman. After we conclude the wisdom sayings in 31:9, we start a new portion, which is that final bookend, 31:10 through 31, and it is a poem entitled An Ode to a Capable Wife. This is the most famous chapter in the book of Proverbs. Often she's referred to as the Proverbs 31 woman, and she's been a long-standing influencer in Christian circles for centuries now. There are lots and lots of sort of swag items that you can find that talk about Proverbs 31 woman becoming her or being her. So there are t-shirts like that exist. There are pieces of wall art that exist that you can purchase. And that sort of merchandise is available, but it's also been very present in church culture that this is a sort of standard that women are expected to live up to. And so if we had the opportunity to discuss this in person, I would try to host great conversation around how you have or have not been influenced by church culture and Christian culture to live up to the standard put forth by this capable wife. And I'm sure that would lead to some interesting reflections. I will share some of mine briefly, which is to say, growing up in the South, this was understood to be the role model for every young woman, that one would become a wife just like Proverbs 31 woman, and that would be the ultimate sort of evolution of yourself as a female, to become like her. To be called a Proverbs 31 woman would mean that you'd achieved a lifelong goal and dream. And the difficulty then would not just be in getting there, but in sustaining that. It's clear that the authors are describing a perfect housewife. She works with textiles. She sews as she takes up the spindle and she's making garments. She's buying groceries. She's running the household with servants under her. She's gardening in a vineyard even. It's not just in her backyard. We're talking about overseeing fields. And she's selling her goods, and she's overseeing her children. She's taking care of her husband. And so here we're getting a very positive description of what it looks like to be a capable wife. And so previously we'd heard from the authors of the book of Proverbs that virtue was derived from wisdom, and that women can choose to be virtuous. But here we're getting a very prescriptive sense of what those actions would entail in order to make her virtuous. So it's positive and it's prescriptive. Some analysis about the Proverbs 31 woman. Although she is running a home, I think it's unfair to characterize her as being homebound, in the sense that, the area of her reign is strictly relegated to the household, that she's sort of hidden behind the walls of her home. Her actions as the queen of her castle are more public than you might have initially thought. She's going out, she's in the marketplace, she's dealing with, folks in the vineyard, she's overseeing servants. So she's in a place of power as well. It's not just public interacting with others in the marketplace and others in the community to procure everything that she needs to run her household and her fields, but she's overseeing accrue. And so she really has reign over her queendom, if you will. It's noted that her husband is known in the city gates, and so is her name. And so the ideal capable wife is not just one who hides in her home, but one who is publicly known. And I just think that's really interesting, because so often when we hear the term housewife as Americans, we're sort of acculturated to hear the 1950s version of a housewife who's very Betty Crocker-esque and very relegated to the home. But then even farther back, historically speaking, it conjures images of the cult of domesticity in early American history, where there was a strong distinction between the private and the public realm, and the cult of domesticity was relegated to the private realm. And here you're seeing that private realm is sort of dismantled. The home, which would be the cult of domesticity in Hebrew times, was more public. And so it's unfair for us to read certain American connotations of what a housewife looks like into the Hebrew text. It's a different version of what a housewife is, or really what a housewife was, and gives us something to think about in terms of what a housewife maybe could be. So again, we've asked the question throughout the study of the text, which woman is being described here? And there are lots of characters that we get introduced to in 1 through 9, and then again here in 31. Is it one woman? Is it all of these women rolled into one? And so is the ideal woman, the ideal wife, a mother? Is she woman wisdom? Is she the teacher? Is she the co-creator? Is she the prophet or the prophetess? And is this Proverbs 31 woman the same as the formerly introduced characters in 1 through 9? The narratival portion, the first bookend, is met with this last bookend, and are they meant to be paired up? Are all of the descriptions of wise women meant to be culminated in this ode to a capable wife? Or are we just seeing a new character introduced here who is the ideal Israelite wife? Lots of options for interpretation. The ode to a capable wife is what this is called. In Hebrew, you can't tell in the English, but in Hebrew it's an acrostic poem. So the entirety of the Hebrew alphabet comprises this poem. Each verse starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes in alphabetical order describing her. And so this acrostic poem is where we get some positive prescriptions for behaviors for women. So yet another question can be raised: is this the moral code that we get that's directly given as instruction to young women? We've gotten 10 through 31:9 as instruction to young men. Is this poem, is this acrostic poem, the instruction for young women? Or is this an exhortation to the wise men to find a virtuous woman like the capable wife, so that she would be the crowning glory of any wise man? Is this just the cherry on top of a wise man's decision making to find a wife like this? Either way, this puts the final bookend on Proverbs. We began with 2 women and we end with 1 woman, and that is the preferred version as per the scriptural authors of what a wise woman would be and who a wise man would pursue as a wife. So, of course, while we're looking at 10 through 31, I want to talk about feminism again, and we'll revisit that. There are feminist and anti-womanist sentiments present in this book overall, but I think that that's open to interpretation in general, as we've seen throughout this study. There are pieces of evidence that go for and against both sides. So, regardless of where you stand on how this creates a voice for women, what most scholars do agree upon is that chapter 31 in the acrostic, there is a picture painted positively of a housewife, and it is therefore really understood to be a beautiful, praiseworthy poem in favor of women. So this text is traditionally understood to be pro-woman. Even though it's describing a housewife, and you could certainly draw out some limitations there in terms of being feminist because it relegates the woman to a specific role. We're reading our version of women's roles into it. Women functioned as housewives in Hebrew culture. And so they are describing and praising what an ideal housewife would be like. So if you're reading it with that culture in mind, then this really is a feminist text on behalf of the Hebrews. And then that in tandem with women's part in creation put forth back in chapter 8, these are two unique instances, scripturally speaking, where the female's position is being elevated to both divine proportions and one that's worthy of praise. And so, for that reason, both chapter 8 and chapter 31, as the primary instances of women being lauded and praised in the book of Proverbs, this is traditionally seen as a pretty feminist book, which is fun. And so some final takeaways. We're closing this study finally, and I want to just sort of wrap it up with a couple of thoughts for you to think through. We pulled out lots of different threads, and some of the takeaways I think that are interesting to focus on as we close it out are the way in which this book is intended to instruct not just a young man, but any reader, how to make sound decisions that benefit yourself and others. We talked about how righteousness was intended to be a communal ethic. And clearly all of the talk about women, while this is directed at young men, goes towards the ethical relationship between males and females. And so there's a huge emphasis on how you wouldn't just comport yourself in society, but how you would do so in relationship with others. And so while this does prescribe a moral code of behavior, it doesn't necessarily prescribe a certain set of religious behaviors. So the idea is that it will shape you well, that you would steer clear of unwise choices in life, and then that would allow all of your other relationships to grow well. Your relationships with yourself, your relationships with others, your relationships with God. So I like to think of this really more as a book that would help to sow seeds. You're planting these seeds in this garden of life, and then hopefully you would come in and you would water them and put sun on them and give them nutrients that would be of a specifically religious ilk so that they could grow in faith. But if you plant them in fertile soil, on the right path, on the wise path, then it will grow well, hopefully. And so that's really the intention here. And I think that regardless of how certain concepts may be specifically situated within the Hebrew context, overall, the main concept applies today. That if you follow the course of wisdom, you're going to increase the benefit that you provide in society. You're going to be much more productive as a member of society, and you are going to have more flourishing in all of your relationships. And so this is a unique text because it is not specifically religious in nature, but it is sort of the beginning of how one might grow in the path towards a religious relationship with God, with self and with others. And so with that, folks, I hope that you have benefited from studying the book of Proverbs. I do have some additional materials to suggest for you. In worship on Sunday, I showed these. These are Proverbial Wisdom for Little Boys and Little Girls by Jim and Elizabeth George. And then a much more conservative version of Reading a Woman's Wisdom is written by Lydia Brownback. This is sort of one version of reading the book of Proverbs, and then you have more progressive liberal readings by scholars Carol Fontaine and Claudia Van Camp. These ladies kind of wrote the book on feminist scholarship in the book of Proverbs. Carol Fontaine writes Smooth Words, Women, Proverbs, and Performance in Biblical Wisdom. And Claudia Van Camp writes Wise, Strange, and Holy, The Strange Woman in the Making of the Bible. Claudia Van Camp is one of the strongest biblical interpreters for the book of Proverbs. And so I share those with you just as a couple of texts if you are interested in further reading. I'd love to point you to those and help you get your hands on them should you be interested. Peace be with you, and blessings on your wise journeys.